History Author Talks. My name is Roger Williams, and I'm the producer of this show. I am very pleased tonight to have three distinguished authors with us, and I will first like to just say that this program is essentially just a matter of bringing authors to readers, and we hope you enjoy the show. I am going to first introduce you to Mike Russell of the Princeton Battlefield Society, and I'll have Mike say a few words about the Princeton Battlefield Society. Mike?
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, History Author Talks, for having the Princeton Battlefield Society as your partner historic site for tonight's meeting. The Princeton Battlefield Society is the ORFO, or the officially recognized Friends Organization for Princeton Battlefield State Park in Princeton, New Jersey. As a licensed ORFO, we work in partnership with the state of New Jersey to maintain and preserve several aspects of the battlefield. The park and battlefield themselves encompass nearly 100 acres of what was once the farms of Quaker brothers Thomas and William Clark. It was the scene of the culminating battle of the 10 crucial days period of late December 1776 and early January 1777. These 10 days brought General Washington and his troops across the Delaware River and into contact with the Hessians and British in both Trenton and Princeton. The Battle of Princeton was an essential and vital victory for Washington's forces during the early portion of the war, and it secured their foothold in New Jersey throughout the rest of the conflict. It also renewed the Army and the cause for independence. And because of this, the Princeton Battlefield Society has chosen its mission to be threefold mainly. First, we try to acquire, protect, and preserve and restore the lands and cultural landscape of the related area in Princeton and the Battle of Princeton of 1777. We also try to enlarge and improve the Princeton Battlefield State Park. And then most importantly, we want to educate the public about the Battle of Princeton, the 10 crucial days, and of course about the Revolution itself. So throughout the year, we offer several events and activities to engage the public and get them involved in the history and research of the battle. And some of these events include Experience the Battle of Princeton, which is a very large reenactment that is right around the time of the battle. We also do a park cleanup day, which is actually part of a nationwide cleanup day sponsored by the American Battlefield Trust. We do a Young Patriots Day for our young citizens. We do Archaeology Day, and we also have scheduled tours throughout the battlefield and the Thomas Clark Farmhouse throughout the year. Of course, we would love your support, and we encourage you to go to our website at www.pbs1777.org, and also follow us on social media, on Facebook and on Instagram. But more importantly, most importantly of this, we would love to see you in person. We'd love to see you at the battlefield. We'd love to engage in a conversation and discussion with you and talk to you about the value of the Princeton Battlefield Society and the Battle of Princeton. So please come to one of our events throughout the year. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, History Author Talks.
Thank you, Mike. I put the link, www.pbs1777.org, on everybody's chat, so you can see it there. Also, before I turn this over to our guest host, I am also putting on the chat that I've just sent to everybody the link for bookshop.org, the link for bookshop.org. If you go to that link, you will find the books for our authors tonight, plus some other books that are similar subject. Of course, if you ever have any questions about books, you can always send me an email. You can just find me at historyauthor.com, or It's very easy to get me. I'm just Roger at rogerwilliamsagency.com. So with that, I would like to, oh, and one other thing. If you have questions for the authors during our event, what I'm going to ask you to do is to use the chat feature and to send your questions to our guest host, who I'm going to introduce right now. So when you see his name on the screen, then you'll know who to send your questions to. And he will be monitoring the questions at the end of the show. So we're going to have our two authors speak, and then we'll have our question and answer period at the end. With that, I want to thank you all for coming, and I'd like to now turn this over to my guest host, Professor Andrew Wehrman from Central Michigan University. And Andrew is the author of the upcoming book, The Contagion in Liberty. So with that, I turn it over to Andrew.
Well, thank you. So my job is to introduce you to our two authors who will be presenting tonight. And after they talk about their own books for 15 to 20 minutes, I'll come back in and ask them my questions. As a historian of early American politics and medicine, I love this stuff too. But also, I'll try not to hog all the questions and let you have yours too. So if you think reading your doctor's handwriting is hard, try doing what these two authors have done and read through archives of 18th century doctors' handwriting, often on microfilm and really terrible, hard to get the contrast right, to read the squiggles. Anyway, they've done it. Tonight we figured we featured two biographers of American founders and early American physicians, Dr. Joseph Warren of Boston and Dr. Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia. They both lived fascinating and important lives, contributing both to medicine and politics in roughly equal measure. Benjamin Rush always found himself, or perhaps put himself, in the center of events in Philadelphia, had a long career as a revolutionary, as a politician, as a physician, and sort of public intellectual. Dr. Joseph Warren, who we'll talk about first, always found himself, or again, put himself in the center of events in the crucible of the revolution in Boston during those crucial years during the 1760s and 1770s. He didn't live a long life, unlike Rush. He was famously killed in the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775. But there's still a lot to think about and compare with these two men, and it's exciting to get the two of them at once as founders who were crucial to the origins of the United States, who yet are still not household names, I don't think. Maybe to the people watching this chat they are, but maybe not to the general public. Anyway, by focusing on their lives, there's much we can learn about the origins of the United States. So first up, I'll present Christian de Spigna. This is his book. I've been spending the afternoon looking through it again. He's the author of Founding Martyr, The Life and Death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero. Dr. Christian de Spigna spent the last 20 years conducting research and writing this book. He graduated from Columbia University and is the co-founder of the Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society. He conducts lectures on various topics relating to early American history. And with that, I'll turn it over to Christian to talk to us about Joseph Warren.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Roger. Stephen, I think you did a great job of putting Benjamin Rush back on the map. And this is a question I always get about Dr. Joseph Warren. I've had people say, well, if he's as important as you say he is, why haven't we heard more about him? And what struck me early on in the research is, why has this figure been so neglected? And I think one of the reasons is he doesn't have, as you mentioned, Andrew, he doesn't have a really long paper trail. He dies early on in the revolution, but beginning with his bringing up in Roxbury, Massachusetts, had as the son of a humble Roxbury farmer rise to the top echelons of the social, political and military circles in Massachusetts. It's really a fascinating story, and it really begins at Harvard. Warren is able to get into Harvard. He starts there. He's socially towards the bottom of that social barrel, which makes his rise even more incredible in this world in Massachusetts. And really, you know, we talk about smallpox. I know Stevens devoted a lot of time to the yellow fever epidemic, and now we relate it to COVID. So really what ironically brings Warren to the forefront of people's minds and acknowledgement is this horrible smallpox outbreak in 1764, and him, along with a couple of dozen doctors, set up a inoculation hospital at Castle William, and incredibly, all of Warren's patients survive. Not one person dies under his watch. We know the earliest description of Warren is from John Adams, when John Adams and his brother come to Castle William for inoculation, and Warren inoculates John Adams' brother. Dr. Nathaniel Perkins inoculates John Adams. And again, it's the earliest description we have of Warren. But I think if you put it in terms of today, if you think about, let's say a vaccine comes out for the COVID, and one of the doctors in a town is administering these vaccines, you know he's going to come to prominence. And this is really what happens with Warren. Since no one dies under his watch, he's a young guy, he's 23, and we're thinking about Boston, which is a really strict social hierarchy. The fact that Warren comes to prominence among all these other better known doctors who are more, I don't want to say infamous, but are more, have been doing it longer. Warren trains under Dr. Lloyd, but again, people now are starting to put themselves under his care. They're listening for his advice for medicine. Think about it. He's in people's lives for the most intimate moments, for the birth of a child, the death of a relative. So people start to put themselves in his care. They start to trust him. Warren really comes on the political scene. You know, I don't discount Samuel Adams, that he was Warren's political mentor, but we have to acknowledge that when Warren does enter this orbit of Whig radicalism, he brings his own political philosophies and ideologies, and I try and trace that back to the Salem witch trials with his great-grandfather and the land bank controversy, which was a shortage of money. But Warren starts to become a prolific writer. He's writing polemical arguments, political tracts. He is a champion of the non-importation agreements. He's involved in every major insurrectionary event in the town of Boston in this decade leading up to independence. He delivers 2 fiery Boston massacre orations. He helps plan the destruction of the tea. He is the author of the Suffolk Resolves. He becomes president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, head of its Committee of Safety. And we call this particular time the 60 days, right? The period between Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, when most of these founders are at the Continental Congress. Warren becomes the on-the-ground leader in Massachusetts, which really becomes the microcosm of the revolution at this point. And, you know, then we can deal in a lot of speculative questions, right? What would have happened had Warren not dispatched Revere and Dawes on this midnight ride? Would there have been a shot heard around the world? Would this have led to a Bunker Hill? Would this have happened? Would we have had a Declaration of Independence? It's just, when you realize how critical Warren is at the center of all these events, the incredible thing was that there's only been a handful of biographies written about him in the past 235 some odd years. And the fact that he was so pivotal to the independence movement, it's just amazing that we don't have more on him. And it's just a shame, because there is, like I said, a lack of primary source documents. Both his sons die early on, but you know, and if we're going to talk about medicine, you know, obviously we know medicine is really basic at this time. Warren does his apprenticeship with Dr. James Lloyd, who has done his medical training over in London. So while Warren doesn't have an official medical degree, he is training under one of the most prominent doctors in Massachusetts at this time. When Lloyd comes back from London, he's bringing back the smallpox inoculations he's championing. He's doing obstetrics, which is replacing midwives. So I think when we talk about Warren and medicine, I think the legacy is more in his descendants, because John Warren, his brother, goes on to be a founder of Harvard Medical School. His nephew, Dr. John Collins Warren, is one of the first doctors to perform an operation with anesthesia. He's a founder of Mass General, the New England Journal of Medicine. There's 9 generations of Harvard doctors. So I think that's where part of his medical legacy lies in. I don't think he did anything quite extraordinary to move forward new techniques in medicine other than practicing obstetrics and doing these smallpox inoculations. But he really is an incredible figure when you think about it, because he's not just a physician. He becomes a military leader. He becomes the Grand Master of ancient Scottish Rite Masons. And this plays an important part as far as the Green Dragon Tavern involved in the planning of the destruction of the tea. So he's just done so much, voice, pen, and sword, and it's been a shame that there hasn't been more about him. And it was my mission in the book to try and bring more awareness to him, try and find some new primary source documents, material culture pieces, and so that was really the mission behind the book.
Thanks, Christian. That gave us a good overview of Warren, and I'm sure we can dig in. But next I want to introduce our next author and the next founder and talk about Dr. Benjamin Rush. So our next author is Stephen Fried. Stephen Fried is an award-winning journalist and historian, best-selling author who's taught at Columbia University and the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of several books. I think he said 6 books. 7. This is his 7th, right? So 6 books anyway, including among the more recent, Appetite for America: How Visionary Businessman Fred Harvey built a railroad hospitality empire that civilized the Wild West. In 2015, Stephen Fried co-authored the New York Times bestseller A Common Struggle: A Personal Journey Through the Past and Future of Mental Illness and Addiction with Congressman Patrick Kennedy, co-authored it with Patrick Kennedy. His current book is Dr. Rush, a biography of Dr. Benjamin Rush. Dr. Rush signed the Declaration of Independence, went on to become, and I introduced him before, a founding father of American medicine called the American Hippocrates, one of the originators of mental health and to create the idea that mental health was a separate and worthy field of medicine on its own, as well as public health and many other things that I'm sure Stephen will talk about. So on you go. Tell us about Dr. Benjamin Rush.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, Christian. It's too bad that Benjamin Rush and Joseph Warren never met. They would have found each other fascinating, and they probably would have spent the entire rest of the 1700s fighting about which city was more important to the American Revolution, Boston or Philadelphia. And I think that most people think that Boston was more important. I would make the argument, and I certainly make it through this book, that we really undervalue what happened in Philadelphia and the view of the entire war from Philadelphia. I live about 6 blocks from where most of that stuff happened, and spend most of my adult life ignoring most of it, just sort of trying to get out of the way of Ben Franklin impersonators and drive around the horses and buggies that take tourists around. But I became very fascinated with the war and what happened down the street from me, and I started looking at ways to tell a new story. And I'm a journalist, so a journalistic story about the American Revolution. And I was astonished that Rush was available. There had been very few biographies of him. Most of them were a really long time ago and not very good. And so I set off to write a biography, not only a biography of Rush, but to use, Rush was not only a fascinating founder, but he did an incredible amount of writing. And he was an incredible observer of the American Revolution. And so what I wanted to do was both write about what he did and write about what he saw as a way of sort of telling an alternative version of the entire, not only the revolutionary period and the constitutional period and the federal period, but what came after. And so while Warren died in 1775, Rush lived until 1813. and he went from, I guess he inherited Warren's mantles to some degree because he became the political insider as a doctor after Warren was gone. Warren was a fighter and a military leader, which Rush was not. I mean, Rush was a military doctor and certainly a military, revolutionary philosopher in lots of ways. And I would say that for the interest of this audience, since Rush had a long life and we could talk about all kinds of different things, and I will say that in the last few weeks, I've talked to a lot of people about the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 and its associations with COVID, which are many, since you couldn't pick a better model for what we're doing well and not doing well now than to go back and look at how everybody screwed up the yellow fever epidemic. You can blame it on the fact that they had no idea what yellow fever was caused by, but the battles between doctors over who was right does look a lot like what we're going through today. And the only difference is that, of course, yellow fever just stopped one day, which I'm not sure that we can count on our current problem to do. So, but Benjamin Rush is really an interesting way of looking at the war because he was, as Christian pointed out, and as Andrew pointed out, he started out as a doctor. He was younger than Warren, and he was basically 30 when he signed the Declaration of Independence. When the Continental Congress first came to Philadelphia in 1774, he was just a local doc who had been politically active. He had actually been one of the authors of the proclamation that had led to the Boston Tea Party, because the Boston Tea Party people used the Philadelphia Proclamation. He also had written a very important pamphlet against slavery and against racial prejudice in 1773, and he had edited Common Sense. In fact, the reason he didn't write Common Sense was because he lost so many of his patients when they found out he had written a pamphlet against slavery that he convinced Thomas Paine to write, and he edited Common Sense. Paine would bring in pages. He titled Common Sense, and he then got it published. And but up to the point of when he joined the Continental Congress, and of course he joined the Continental Congress right as the Declaration was being signed, because his friend John Dickinson would not sign it. And so he replaced John Dickinson in the Pennsylvania delegation and signed the Declaration. And we have great descriptions of things like the Declaration signing just because Rush was such a good writer. I will say that one of the reasons you don't know more about Rush is because Rush was such a good writer and such a good correspondent. And what actually happened was Rush was extremely close to many of the founders, especially John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And later in their lives, there were hundreds of letters between all of them, incredibly personal letters. And when Rush died in 1813, having just completed sort of the greatest family founding father therapy of all time by getting Adams and Jefferson back together, Adams and Jefferson both came to the Rush family and asked them not to release all the letters that they had from them. And the family chose not to release the autobiography that Rush had been writing. And Rush had certainly done an incredible amount of writing, part of which was almost like a burn book version of the American Revolution, where he wrote what he really thought about every person who signed the Declaration and every general in the army. And the family, after he was gone, was afraid to let that come out because his son Richard was rising in the government. His son James had inherited his position at the U.S. Mint, which the family was living off of, and they didn't want to get in trouble because Benjamin Rush, among other things, was very open with John Adams about their criticisms of George Washington. These criticisms today would seem pretty tame and things that people talk about all the time, but that was not what was done back then. And in fact, Rush's most interesting writing and the writing that was written to him was suppressed by the family for over 100 years. It didn't start coming out until the 1940s, when a good bit of it was auctioned off because one of Rush's heirs had to auction it off. And we still haven't processed a lot of Rush's writing. So I'm really happy that I was able to do a full biography of Rush, and in a way that hopefully is interesting to not only historians, but general readers like me who wanted to hear the story of the American Revolution told through fresh eyes. But I will say that one of the reasons that I've done so many talks to try to get the word out there about Benjamin Rush is that I really want to encourage professional historians, lay historians, kids in school who are interested in this to dig into this material. There's actually so much of Rush's material that no one's done much with. because he did an enormous amount of writing about almost anything. And so I am looking forward to people doing more and more scholarship on the different aspects of Rush's life. I will say that during the time that he was in the war, you know, he was in the Continental Congress through February of 1777, when he was voted out for having the wrong opinion on separation of church and state by the Pennsylvania delegation, because the Pennsylvania Constitution did not separate church and state, which is a whole other issue. But by that time, he had really sort of gotten involved more in the military. He left the Congress to go be on the front lines. We have our wonderful descriptions of what George Washington was like the night before the crossing of the Delaware, because Rush was with him. He was with him because they were friends. He was with him because he was a Continental Congressman. And he actually sent orders back to Cadwalader through Rush. Rush crossed the Delaware after Washington, was there to take care of patients after the Battle of Trenton, and then showed up after the Battle of Princeton, which he went to Princeton. So, of course, it was very traumatic for him to go to Princeton to see that Nassau Hall, where he had been a student, was being attacked. And at the same time, his father-in-law, Richard Stockton, was also a signer, was being held prisoner by the British at this point. So, but Rush was left that role and then became a Surgeon General for the Middle Department for the year of 1777 into 78. He wrote the most important treatise on medical care in the military, really preventive medical care in the military, which was published in the newspaper first because he wasn't sure that his higher-ups would do it. And then Washington ordered it to be given out to all the troops. And he lived through the Battle of Princeton, the Battle of Trenton, good battles for our side. And then a terrible year of just loss after loss after loss in 1777. Brandywine, just a mess. To the point where by the end of that year, he became convinced that maybe either Washington wasn't the right guy or the people Washington had put in place weren't the right guys. Out of sheer frustration, he wrote a very famous letter to Patrick Henry about this, which he asked Henry to destroy. Henry did not destroy it, but he gave it to Washington 2 months later. It's one of these letters like an email that you write that you know you're not supposed to send, but you sort of push the send button by mistake. And because of this, after he had already left the military for reasons that had to do with internal battles with other doctors, the doctors who ran the military hospitals were all from Philadelphia, and they had all been fighting for 10 years before the war ever started. So they just continued fighting during the war, and Rush got pushed out over that. After he was gone, Henry gave Washington this letter, and Washington was crushed because Washington and he were friends, and Washington never forgave that. And so that letter hung over Washington and Rush's relationship for the next 30 years. So part of what's really cool about Rush is that you get to hear a really personal version of the founders. Rush took everything personally. It's not surprising he became the founding father of mental health care because he paid a lot of attention to what people thought, to their emotions, and to their mental health. He treated a lot of the kids and spouses of founders who had mental health and addiction issues. So he knew people at a very close personal level, and he allows you to see the revolution, I think, through that prism, which is honestly, whatever kind of book I'm writing about is always what I'm looking for, the ability to get that close to people. So I'm glad that you can get that close to a lot of the founding fathers and their wives and their kids through Rush. Because, of course, his wife was a founding mother. She was married to a signer and the daughter of a signer. And their kids and the Adams kids and the Hamilton kids were friends. So it's also sort of a family of the founders book. I'll stop here and we'll start taking some questions.
Thanks, that was great. And I think I'm seeing a number of questions. I would be happy to receive more now that you've heard both authors speak and give you a bit of time to formulate a question and type it into the chat, and then I can present it. I think the way I may do it is to start with medicine and then kind of work to politics or something. I don't know if I can keep that, but that's the way I was thinking about it, and the way the first question came in, which was, and it's at least several of the questions are sort of for both of you, so you can talk about who goes first. But this question was, who was considered to be the leading innovators when it came to developing new treatment methods and new medicines and technology, or if I could add, who did Rush and Warren look up to in medicine? Where did they get their ideas?
Stephen, you want to take that one? Because
Sure.
I think, yeah.
I don't want to make this out like this was a period of incredible medical innovation. This is a period, honestly, when medicine starts becoming more medical after being more philosophical. And of course, Rush is involved. He's one of the first professors at the first medical school in America, which begins in Philadelphia in the 1760s, where he was also a student. But I think that it's very clear that at this time, the university in Edinburgh was where people went to medical school. That was considered to be the finest medical school in the world. And then people went for practical training at the many hospitals in London. There are not a ton of medical innovations during this time. Certainly Rush comes back from Europe in 1769, knowing the new method, the Suttonian method of doing smallpox vaccination, which was a little different than what had been done before. It gave the person a little bit less of actual smallpox, caused smallpox less. And this was the vaccination that he convinced Washington to give to all the troops, which many believe is the most important public health thing that was done in the entire Revolutionary War, was giving those shots to the troops. I would say that Rush's biggest innovation was in mental health and addiction. In one point, making the point that these were medical diseases that needed to be treated with the best they had available in medicine. But the best they had available in medicine wasn't so great. The main treatments that Warren would have learned, that Rush would have learned, still came out of purges, bloodletting, bark that had quinine in it, hot and cold compresses, some opiates for painkillers. But I would say that medicine was not well organized at this time. Although what's interesting is, we do have all of Rush's medical lectures. And he gave, once the medical school was in place at Penn, he gave lectures every year, and we have those lectures so you can see how medicine is being taught. Some of the things we now would consider ridiculous because we now know about infection, which they did not. They focused a lot on blood because blood was the thing that they could take a pulse, knew how to quicken the pulse, they could see blood. So a lot of things were focused through blood. And some of the medications they use today and some of the things they did today, we would never do again. But I don't think we should think of this as a time, one, of huge innovation, or two, to blame Warren or Rush for the treatments that they were using because they didn't invent hardly any of them. They were more, practical doctors who treated a lot of patients than they were innovators. At some point, Rush met Joseph Priestley. Joseph Priestley had invented oxygen. So these were not men who did that. These were men I bet Rush would tell you that his innovations were political and that he had certain ideas about medical education. He did have a grand theory of how the body worked, but he never thought that he had proved it or anything like that. And his treatments looked like a lot of other treatments that had come from people who had gotten their educations in Europe at that time.
I always tell my students that, as with modern doctors, 18th century doctors thought they knew everything, right? They weren't bemoaning some future in which they'd figure out how things work.
That's not completely true. That's not completely true. I know that people think of Rush as this incredible egotist, but when you look at the lectures he gave at the medical school to prospective doctors, he was actually quite humble about the fact that he was sure that many of the things they were doing will later be proved to be ridiculous. I mean, he understood that. He respected science, and he was in the same position all doctors are, the same as doctors today. They have to use everything they have at their disposal and know every day the things that they don't know yet, and still make smart decisions and do the best they can. But Rush was not as egotistical that way as I think people thought. He needed to be strong because people wanted their doctors to be strong. but he was pretty open about the fact that he was sure that there would be many changes coming, and he looked forward to them. He didn't bemoan them, but he couldn't wait for them.
To talk about Warren, Warren didn't have that European medical training. He didn't go to Edinburgh, but he was, Harvard educated, such as that was in the 1760s. Tell us about kind of Warren's medical education and what he did. I know you have a part in the book where you talked about that I found really interesting on Warren actually performing autopsies on some of the victims in early confrontations in Boston.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So Warren does not do any training in Europe. He apprentices under Dr. Lloyd, who had done his apprenticeship over in Europe. And Dr. Lloyd is one of the leading physicians at the time. And like I had mentioned earlier, he's championing smallpox inoculations. And really, obstetrics at this point is handled by midwives. And this really starts to turn with Lloyd and Warren. So I think one of the important things is that when Warren is doing his apprenticeship under Lloyd, he's not just learning medicines, new techniques, how to master the nuances of a bedside manner. Warren's learning how to become a gentleman. He's living under Lloyd's roof for a time. Lloyd is socially connected. He has money. He's influential. So this humble Roxbury farmer is learning how to entertain guests, the finer things in life, how to become a gentleman. And Lloyd really becomes Warren's first mentor because Warren's father dies when he's 14 years old as a freshman in college. And the interesting thing is that Lloyd remains a staunch loyalist throughout the Revolution. So when you look at some of Warren's early mentors, they're loyalists. And I think I read something somewhere, and we put this together in the research, that I think 1/5 of the doctors that were being trained were trained by Lloyd and Warren. And every single doctor that Warren was training under his apprenticeship goes on to become a staunch Whig. William Eustis, who later becomes the governor of Massachusetts. We have John Warren, like I said, who is one of the founders of Harvard Medical School. And we read about this sort of really mysterious club at Harvard called the Spunkers Club that was headed by John Warren, and a lot of credit is due to Dr. Joseph Warren because they start doing anatomical experiments. There's talk about getting a cadaver to do experiments on it, which really has to be done in secrecy. And, again, like Stephen said, just to piggyback on that, they're not coming through with any medical breakthroughs, right? They're learning these methods from schools over in Europe, right? From their medical mentors. But, one interesting thing I found that really right before the siege of Boston, in Warren's library is a book that he has called Diseases Incident to Armies. And we know that Warren's family, and I had spoken with Stephen Koss about this, who was on the show last week, that Warren's family really was early on champions of these smallpox inoculations. His grandfather, Dr. Samuel Stevens, was inoculated. He had his son inoculated. So we know that Warren is someone who is really a proponent of these. And really at the time, it's still not a popular practice, right? We know about this riot in Marblehead, Massachusetts in the 1770s about the smallpox hospital. But again, we see that Warren is training these future leaders, and a lot of them serve in the Continental Army. And again, like I mentioned earlier, I think that when you really point to his medical career, it's really more of these students that he's training that will go on to do great things, as well as his descendants.
Is there something about, and this is kind of for both, something about being a doctor, being a physician that leads these men into becoming revolutionaries? Is there something about the trust that their fellow citizens had in them that carried weight in politics? Is there a connection between that these two people were trained physicians who also became important in politics?
I can take the first. You want to take that, Stephen? No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I think with Warren that he's wearing so many hats at this point. I don't think it's just one thing for the medicine, although that brings him some notoriety in the beginning with the smallpox inoculations. And I think it does build a level of trust between himself and his patients. You know, we looked at this small narrative of the horrid massacre in Boston that Warren was one of 3 authors that wrote this. And basically this was a propaganda piece about the Boston massacre. And so many of the people that they had interviewed, the deponents of this, were medical patients of Warren. So I think it does have part to do with becoming a revolutionary. I think in Warren's case, it also had to do with his Masonic ties, because this is where he's introduced to men like Paul Revere, John Hancock, Thomas Crafts, who's a son of liberty. I also think it has to do with his family and how they suffered under this land bank scheme, his connection to Samuel Adams. But I think that as far as Warren going to Harvard and becoming a doctor, he's not just a professional, he becomes a gentleman. And this really gains him a lot of respect. And I was always fascinated by the fact that, you know, Warren's running in these circles with men that are so much older than him, and they're showing him a deference and a respect that is really unusual at this time. Because if you think about it, Warren's family is not this rich, politically powerful family. I mean, they're these humble farmers from Roxbury. So, you know, I think with Warren, it's one slice of this whole pie that really brings him into this revolutionary movement.
There's 2 things that I would note about that question. First of all, look, there's always in America a percentage of doctors who want to be politically active. That's been true since the beginning of the country. And they do it at their own risk, because if you're political, then you might be offending patients or potential patients. And so not every doctor is going to be willing to do that. In Philadelphia, the doctors who did, of course, I mean, Rush's 2 mentors, William Shippen and John Morgan, both ran the hospitals in the Revolution. So obviously they were involved in the Revolution. I think part of it has to do with being educated and being a good writer. I mean, Rush was useful as a young doctor because he was a really smart, talented, fast writer. And they needed somebody to do that. And so part of the reason that some of the things that he wrote were important were partly because he was a good writer. The other thing that I will say, the more I got to know about Rush and the more I looked at his entire career, I do think there's a difference about the way that founders who are doctors view the entire experience of creating America than most of the founding fathers who were either lawyers or businessmen. And one of the ways of looking at it is this: doctors don't think the way lawyers do, that you can pass a law and make something change. Whereas I think doctors, and if you look at Rush's writing about the Revolution, it's not surprising that Rush is the first one after the American Revolution who says the war is over, but the revolution is just starting. And the revolution's going to always continue, because you can't just, you know, there's basic things that we have created here that are always going to be in conflict with each other. I mean, one of the most amazing lines that Rush wrote was he talked about America being a place where science, religion, liberty, and good government would always be in tension. And I think he's right. And I think that as a doctor, that was okay with him. That was reality. Whereas I think sometimes the founders, especially when they wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, I think they had this idea that, okay, we're done with that. Whereas I think that Rush's attitude towards this was always, in every generation, you made a little bit of progress on the things that really mattered, but that America was an experiment. And what I love about Rush's writing during a period that I think people don't pay enough attention to, which is his writing right after the Revolution, when he sort of re-engages, because let's face it, he got thrown out of the Revolution because of his battles with the medical establishment in the middle of the war. But he re-engages on the issues, first of all, of education. He's, you know, absolute screaming all the time about the importance of, we have to be good citizens. We have to figure out how to be a citizen of this country we just invented. That first means education. And he also thought that many things would not be taken care of by the government, and that there needed to be, just as Franklin had thought earlier, more voluntary associations, philanthropic associations, that would address social problems that we just could not write a law to make go away. So I think that Rush was invited in because as a doctor, he had certain skills. The fact that he knew everybody and knew everybody's personal problems didn't hurt. But I do think when the time came to really create the country and think about what a more perfect union was going to be, having a physician in that mix was really important, and it's a reason why Adams and Jefferson loved talking to Rush about this stuff, and why their dialogues, especially in the last 15 years of their lives, are just unbelievable.
On that, so that was a great, I think, answer. And I think, yeah, and in the medicine sort of influenced the politics in some ways. And when you think of the word constitution, medical doctors in the 18th century would have thought of a constitution as a balance, a bodily, balance of health. And I think that understanding politics as a sort of constant battle of balance between forces, I think that's kind of what you're saying. So I've got a lot of questions that I need to answer maybe in a little bit quicker
Faster.
pace.
Go ahead.
On your last note, Stephen, that is only a subtle response to you. So I saw it here. Okay. So so can Stephen talk about Rush's efforts to bring Jefferson and John Adams together in later years? How did that, how did he kind of bring their relationship back together?
Sure. So Jefferson and Adams and Rush had a fascinating relationship, and they loved being together in Philadelphia. And then, the election of 1800 obviously blew apart the relationship between Adams and Jefferson, and it blew apart the three of them. Three of them never saw each other again. After the capital moved to Washington, and then Adams went home. So Rush was in touch some with Jefferson the whole time, which is how he gets asked to run the Lewis and Clark expedition and stuff like that. But 5 years after he hasn't heard from Adams, they start writing. Adams reaches out to him and says, we should talk before one of us dies. And so they start this epic, correspondence, hundreds of letters that go on from 1805 until Rush's death in 1813. One of Rush's ulterior motives is that he believes that if Adams and Jefferson don't get back together before one of them dies, it means that America is never going to be able to survive, because if politics separated the people who he considered to be the two greatest minds of the revolution. He believed that Jefferson and Adams had basically thought of the revolution and basically their ideas informed it. And if partisan politics broke up that relationship, what was the future for the country? So he at first was subtle and then was not so subtle. And he basically courted the two of them back together for several years, certainly encouraged by Abigail Adams. And finally in 1812, after a number of letters, including the really famous one where Rush writes to Adams and says he had a dream, and in the dream his son's reading them from a history book from the future, and in that book it says that next week he and Jefferson are going to get back together. Jefferson and Adams start writing to each other, and ironically, Rush did this because he was afraid one of them was going to die. They're older than him, but instead, Rush only lives another year, so he gets to see that correspondence for a year, and then fascinatingly, they keep corresponding, and their kids pick up the correspondence. So the correspondence from after Rush's death from 1813 until the other two founders die is similarly fascinating, and it's driven by Adams and Jefferson and by John Quincy and by Richard Rush, and it's amazing.
On that note, you mentioned, Deborah would like to know, so that Rush kept this sort of commonplace book of his observations about the other signers of the Declaration, and she wants to know, has this information been lost, or is it available and still being processed? Do we have that? Okay,
here it is.
Guess we do.
This is my dog-eared copy of it. Okay, so two books came out about Benjamin Rush in the late 1940s and early 1950s, which I think people don't know exist because they've been out of print for so long. Okay, one of them is this book, The Autobiography of Benjamin Rush, which includes the complete autobiography and all his known commonplace books, which were annotated by George Corner, who was actually a doctor from Johns Hopkins. This is a great book. You have to buy it on eBay. It's been out of print since the early 1950s. And also the 2-volume set of the letters of Benjamin Rush. These are only the outgoing letters. This book was published in 1951. It's never been updated. But these two books are the core of Rush scholarship. And part of the reason I'm so interested in talking to people about them is because they are so desperately in need of being updated. They are used by every historian, and they are full of mistakes. like any book that was written in 1951 and never updated would be. But these are the texts, not only about Rush, but about all Rush's interactions. So like, again, that description of Washington the night before the Declaration of before he crosses the Delaware, that's from this. That's from Rush's commonplace books. So these books are fascinating. And I hope that the American Philosophical Society, which published them originally, would consider republishing them and updating them, because they exist. And yeah, so you can read Rush's commonplace books and his autobiography. There are still some of his things that haven't been digitized, but those main things were a long time ago.
And another question about Rush. I found it puzzling why Rush owned a slave, but yet he helped start the first African-American church in Philadelphia. Could you talk a little bit about Rush's relationship and ideas about slavery, and perhaps his own personal ownership?
I can. It is puzzling that Rush owned a slave. He owned one slave, enslaved person. His name is William Grubber. He purchased him from a boat captain sometime in the late, right after the war, probably in 1780, and he freed him in the late 1780s. He did not own a slave when he wrote his pamphlet on abolition in the 1770s. He did not own a slave when he signed the Declaration of Independence, even though you see that on the internet everywhere. I don't know why Rush purchased this slave. When you read about him, it's possible he did because he had medical and drinking problems, and he helped him get over that. But he did own this slave, and he freed him when the Abolition Society was restarted by he and Benjamin Franklin in 1787. And but he was pretty open about it, and he actually wrote a fascinating piece called "The Paradise of Negro Slaves," in which he has a dream, and all African American slaves tell him to go back to white people and tell them how horrible they had been to them. And so I think he was tortured by this himself a little bit. There's no indication that people, actually I should say, there's not a whole lot of indication that people knew at the time that he owned a slave. In fact, I've never seen any piece of writing in public writing that shows that. So, but at the same time, Rush was very active with the Black church. Reverend Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were friends of his, and they had felt prejudice in the churches that they had originally gone to, which Black people and white people went to. So Rush wrote the plan up for the first free Black church, and that plan was being executed, and the first free Black church was being built with Rush's help in 1793 when the yellow fever epidemic broke out. That is one of the reasons people don't always seem to understand why the Black clergy got involved in helping Rush take care of the patients, because they had been working together on this church. By the time yellow fever was over, the two reverends decided they wanted to each have their own church. And so in the summer of 1794, Rush helped them open both Mother Bethel AME, which is still there right down the street from my house, and the Episcopal Church of St. George, which is now out in the suburbs. But the relationship between Rush and the African American community is utterly fascinating. People tend to know a little tiny bit about it and make big generalizations. But look, Rush was a confusing guy. I think he was confused about this himself, but you need to dig into the details to see what really happened, because in reality, most of the founders considered Rush to be the most active, not only abolitionist, because keep in mind that one of Rush's biggest political issues was racial prejudice against free Blacks, which he considered to be an equally important problem that people were not addressing, especially after Hamilton made the deal and slavery was off the table for 20 years. So they were focused a lot on making sure that those Blacks who were already free stayed free and could take loans to start businesses and stuff like that. Those are the kinds of things that Rush worked on. He was the president in later years of the National Society of State Abolition Societies.
I've got a question that has been come in a couple of times, insistent and good one. I think I might be able to answer it, but we'll see. From Henry Kozik, who is a graduate of the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy and the first School of Pharmacy. Anyway, he asks, how does Dr. Hall Jackson fit into the inoculation clinics of 1764? J. Worth Estes, a great medical historian, wrote the book Hall Jackson and the Purple Foxglove. And he goes into quite a bit of detail about inoculation clinics. Do you know how Hall Jackson fits in?
Christian?
No, go ahead, Stephen.
No, it's not me. This is about the clinics in Boston.
This might be for me. I don't know. So Hall Jackson was from New Hampshire, and he was a smallpox inoculator, doctor in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, who comes to Boston during the 1764 epidemic, and he helps with that effort to inoculate Bostonians. He's one of the couple of dozen doctors that Christian mentioned, along with Joseph Warren. Hall Jackson's the doctor who inoculates at the Marblehead Hospital that I write about in my book that gets burned down by angry colonists. So I guess that's how he fits in. He's another one of these figures. I think maybe less politically involved, but who and is more medically involved. Does things with foxglove, which if I recall, it aids in heart conditions, pleurisy, I think. Anyway, I hope that helps, Henry. We can email me later. We'll talk about Hall Jackson. I should ask another.
If I may, Andrew, I'm going to step in for a second. We only have a few minutes left, and there's a few questions, or a question I always like to ask all of our guests. I'm interested in what work you're doing now. You don't have to tell us what the title of your book is, but what kind of work you're involved in now. Christian, I'd be interested in hearing what's up with you.
So I was initially looking into something about James Wilson, because I think he's really another underrepresented figure during this period. But I've kind of pivoted, and it's made it difficult now with the COVID to really get out there and do some research. But before this happened, I really started looking at some of the deaths of not just the founding fathers, but the revolutionaries, right? We focus so much on their lives. And really, when I was writing about Warren, I found so much, really a treasure trove of information from his post-mortem journey, right? I mean, he's reburied at least 4 times. You know, you start looking into the papers of his colleagues, his family, his friends, and you start to learn so much information. I was able to uncover so many questions I had that were unanswered, but now I'm really looking into the final days and post-mortem journeys of some of these better known figures and also lesser known figures from the revolutionary, some African-American patriots, women, Native Americans. So I'm kind of dabbling in that right now. And I'm really finding some really fascinating things.
Stephen, how about you?
Well, you know, I continue to work on Rush. Rush is not finished. We're building a Rush portal at the University of Pennsylvania with the library company right now, which I'm happy to share the address with people who are viewing tonight. And I've been doing writing on some of the issues. I did a big piece for American Heritage, going back over yellow fever research, and did some more yellow fever research. So I'm going to continue to do that. I continue to give lectures in that area because I love it. It's a great time to be talking about Benjamin Rush and about medicine during that time. I am working on a proposal about a progressive era American political hero, which is based largely in the early 1900s, which I will not tell anybody about until it's sold. And I also have been working on a mental health project. I have been interviewing the founding father of cognitive therapy, Aaron Beck, who turned 99 last week. And we've been working for the last year on a biography project. And I do magazine writing as well. And I'm teaching, right now I'm teaching at Columbia Medical School. I'm teaching doctors how to do journalism, and I will be teaching a course at Penn starting in a couple of weeks on nonfiction writing about mental health and addiction. So, so that's what I'm doing.
That sounds great. And Andrew, tell us when your book is coming out.
I hope my book, The Contagion of Liberty, which talks about the history of smallpox inoculation and the politics of smallpox in the 18th century. It's signed with Johns Hopkins University Press. Either will come out the end of next year or spring 2022, I think is what they tell me.
Well, that sounds terrific. And as we wind up here in our hour, I wanted to thank everyone for coming. I certainly want to let you know about next week's show. We have Nina Sankovic, who's written a book called American Rebels about the Hancock, Adams, and Quincy families, and also J.L. Bell, who has written the book about the four cannons at Concord. He's terrific. So those are going to be our guests next week. I very much appreciate the time that we have had with Christian de Spigna and his book Founding Martyr, Stephen Fried, and his book Rush. And I thank the capable hands of our guest host, Andrew Wehrman, with his book coming up, The Contagion of Liberty. I also want to thank again our partner in history, the Princeton Battlefield Society. For anyone who only got to see half the show, this is being taped and it will be on the website. So please let your friends and family know to go to historyauthortalks.com for some other great shows. Thank you all.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Take care.